Thank you, Corey. It's a pleasure to be here. So sometime last year, June Halper and I were reminiscing about the good old days and the bad old days, and where we were and where we've been. And then she invited me to give this talk. It's an expansion on something that Stephen Krieger and I wrote a commentary piece on in the MS Journal at the end of last year. So I'm going to take you on a tour of where we're going and where we've been. These are my disclosures, and I must say I'm delighted to have this opportunity, so I thank the CMSC. So here's the agenda of what we've learned. We're going to go through all of these various elements, I hope. Let me see. I see the timer, so that's good. The best parts are going to be at the end. But this was the start of the era. So this was March of 1993, the publication of the interferon beta-1b study, which was a seminal event in multiple sclerosis and a seminal event in all of neurology because it stamped multiple sclerosis as the leader of the burgeoning field of neurotherapeutics, and that's still the case, even though our colleagues are now catching up. This also started the trend of doing clinical trials in MS, because prior to this successful trial, biotechs and pharmaceuticals didn't want to come to the MS clinic, because they said, well, you've never had a successful trial, you don't know anything about your disease, what the cause is, or anything like that. Why should we waste our money? But once this happened, they got much more interested. And of course, that burgeoned into everything you see now, the full landscape of 20-plus disease-modifying therapies that we have. But despite that, and our pride in having that, cause of MS is still unknown. We have many things that we've thought about over these last 30 years, and molecular mimicry is always been there, raised its head a little more now. Vitamin D as a susceptibility marker, not a severity marker. Viruses and microbes have long been implicated, and now we're spending a lot of energy on EBV, and I'll comment on that in just a little bit. There's still some possibility that this starts on the inside as an oligodendrogliopathy and the immune response to that. There have been vascular claims. We had the embarrassment of CCSVI, which is now a distant memory, and most of you may not even recall it, and I'm not going to go into it. And there's always been this issue of toxic and certainly environmental issues that we'll come back to. So there's a long history of implicating pathogens in MS, including Charcot and Pierre-Marie raised the issue. Steve Jacobson gave me this slide, and it's a little hard to read, but all you need to know is everything on the right there were viruses that were thought to be the cause of multiple sclerosis. And when each one came out, it made a big splash, and then it kind of died down. And if you could see on EBV, it came up multiple times in the past and in the present. But just there's measles. Measles came out in '72 when people thought, this is it. We've found the cure for MS. It's immunizing everyone for measles. And that turned out not to be the case. HTLV1, which it's on here too, got a big splash, not the case. And just a thought that we're not alone in looking at EBV. Multiple rheumatologic disorders and inflammatory disease disorders have implicated EBV as well in their disease. So just something to think about when you start thinking about EBV having specific CNS cross-reactivity. Now in pathophysiology, we have these various slides of the immunopathogenesis of MS. And I'm going to take a different take on it because the first thing we thought about, especially based on EAE, was that this was a T-cell mediated disease. And then we found that there were subtypes of T cells, Th1 and Th17, and we were happy with that. It followed from the EAE model, which is very much a T-cell model. But then it turns out that B cells were involved, and we learned this from the rheumatologists when they looked at anti-CD20 in rheumatoid arthritis. And now, in fact, that's one of our more successful therapeutic approaches, so that we've expanded into over this time. And then when we look at the effects, we've always known that demyelination was an issue. Axonal degeneration raised its head again in the late 90s, but it had been discussed by pathologists, Charcot, other pathologists in the 1920s. So we were thinking about that as well, especially in the acute lesion. And we see that again now when we look at things like NFL, which is most representative of acute lesions, and that suggests the damage of the axon in those acute lesions. And then even more recently, looking at neuronal loss and cortical lesions, which we hadn't been paying a lot of attention to, but now we do, and it turns out they're very important. And then we also are trying to look not only at the adaptive immune system, which is what almost all of our therapies are directed against, but also the innate immune system, in the hope that by looking for therapies that working within the central nervous system, the innate immune system in the central nervous system, microglia, other toxic glia, macrophages that come in, we may get a better handle on progressive disease. And so we're thinking about this in terms of relapsing MS being more adaptive immune-based, because we've been successful in treating it with agents that alter the adaptive immune system, and the more progressive aspects of the disease involving the innate immune system. At least that's our hope, because the therapies that we're looking at right now for treating progressive disease, our hope is that they're having an effect on the innate immune system. And then there's other areas of the brain that we're starting to think about, and we can even visualize to some degree with PET. I think I stole this slide from Peter Calabrese, but looking at synaptic pathology and what that means moving forward. And it's another target that we need to reduce or eliminate before we can get to progressive disease. Another major message that's come from autopsy series and such is that inflammation is present throughout the course of multiple sclerosis, from the very start through the even burned out cases. This has been an important lesson for us because it generates some enthusiasm for looking at anti-inflammatory agents, especially adaptive immune inflammatory agents, in progressive disease. And just to remind you that we still need to think about neurophysiology, not just immunology, especially when we start to consider elements of neuroprotection and regeneration. We're going to have to think about what happens to nerves when they get demyelinated. So the good thing that happens when you demyelinate a nerve is you get upregulation of sodium channels to help maintain linear conduction. The bad part of that is you upregulate sodium channels, and if you do that for a long time, you start to get sodium-calcium exchange instead of sodium-potassium exchange, and that leads to neurodegeneration. So these are things that we need to think about. We need to think about the physiology when we look about repair, think about visual evoked responses and other metrics that will need to provide some objective evidence outside of the clinical exam on repair strategies. Now, epidemiology has changed. It's changed. We haven't changed it, but our understanding of the epidemiology has changed. For example, this slide says most cases occur between 15 and 45, but we're all seeing an older population. And the average age of a MS population prevalence is higher now. And it's not clear why that's happening. And at least anecdotally in our practice, we're seeing people in their 50s coming in with like acute optic neuritis and such, the kind of thing we're used to seeing in young individuals in their 20s. And the ratio of women to men has gone from 2-to-1 to 3-to-1 or more over the last 10 to 15 years, 20 years. That can't be genetic. That has to be environmental, and then we have to say why. Worldwide prevalence also has changed over this period. So 30 years ago, we thought of MS as a Northern European, North American disorder, never seen around the equator, which is probably still mostly true, and seen primarily in the white race. Now we're seeing more MS coming from the Middle East, the Asians, the Indian subcontinent. South America has seen lots of it. It's still kind of following the latitudinal gradient, both above and below the equator, but the prevalence is spreading, and that again suggests something environmental, but not yet clear what. The economic and social impact has been enormous. So 30 years ago, no payer paid any attention to what they were spending on multiple sclerosis. And that changed dramatically, and all of you, the providers, know how hassled you are by insurance companies not wanting to pay for expensive medications and cutting deals for this one or that one. And so it has very much hit their radar screens because of the expenses. Importantly, they did a proper study of the incidence, the prevalence rather, of MS in the United States, because they were using a well outdated number, and it's almost 1 million individuals, maybe more by now. The number worldwide is probably an underestimate. The importance of the disease is not so much that it shortens lifespan, which it does by a little bit, depending on how hard you look, but it produces disability that lasts for long periods of time. And so it has major cost implications on the healthcare system. Mechanisms of worsening are fairly straightforward. Clinically, either you have residual from a relapse, and that happens about 50% of the time, maybe more depending on how hard you look, and we call that raw, relapse-associated worsening. Or you have the gradual worsening that's in progressive disease, or now the time PIRA, progression independent of relapse activity, and we'll talk a little more about that. Pathologically, we think that relapses are inflammatory disease. We have very good evidence for that. The pathologic underpinning for progressive disease is more complicated, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. So we think it's neurodegeneration, but there's inflammation there as well, and it may be an oversimplification. So the classic diagnosis from days of Charcot, lesions of the central nervous system disseminated in time and space, with the caveat that there be no better explanation. We've developed diagnostic criteria over time. In 1999, when I was running one of the committees for the National MS Society, and Steve Reingold was the director of science there, we decided that it was time for a review of the diagnostic criteria. And that led to the first McDonald criteria, the McDonald 2001, which modernized how we were using multiple sclerosis and brought the MRI into multiple sclerosis as a surrogate. McDonald was modified 2005, 2010, and 2017, and this is the 2017, and each time it was revised, it made diagnosing multiple sclerosis easier while still maintaining good sensitivity and specificity. But back in 2001, for example, dissemination in space, you had to count 9 lesions, and it was more cumbersome, and a lot of people didn't like it. And now I'll show you dissemination in space is much easier. Dissemination in time has always been easy. It's another event, a new MRI lesion, a new attack, but also added in 2017 was oligoclonal bands presence could take away the need for dissemination in time. And these were the areas of dissemination in space. It's still very important when we evaluate patients. So periventricular, cortical and juxtacortical, infratentorial, and spinal cord. And one of the remarkable things about multiple sclerosis, it's maybe the only disease I can think of that can give you asymptomatic lesions in the spinal cord. And then there's McDonald 2024, which is embargoed until ECTRIMS. But here are some hints. So think about Albert Einstein and the space-time continuum. Space and time, they're all the same thing. It's coming soon. Think about the eyes, because the neuro-ophthalmologists were very upset with McDonald 2017 and were not shy about expressing their unhappiness. Dissemination in space is becoming more important. Have to think about advanced MRI metrics. You've heard about these already at this meeting, like central vein sign and paramagnetic rim lesions. And think about kappa-free light chains in the spinal fluid. And so these are going to become very important. So central vein sign is really helpful if you have the techniques to look at it. And even though most routine MRIs do not read for central vein signs or for paramagnetic rim lesions, it is our hope that by putting these into criteria that will move the community, and especially the radiologists, to start looking for these. Now, the problem with that is that MRI scans are done on time. So every time we go to our neuroradiologist to say we want to add a sequence, they say, sure, what are you taking away? Because they don't want to increase scan time. So this is something we're going to have to deal with. But it's a central vein sign, which is highly specific, not totally specific, but highly specific for multiple sclerosis. And these paramagnetic rim lesions are very specific for multiple sclerosis. So there's something to look at. And also you've heard about, in addition, these slowly expanding lesions. And you heard from Dr. Okuda yesterday that these occur more than we have ever thought or normally pick up. And it's something we'll have to think of over time, because paramagnetic rim lesions, slowly expanding lesions, portend a worse clinical course. They don't define any clinical course in terms of relapsing, remitting, primary or secondary progressive, but they portend a worsening course. And then the differential diagnosis has expanded over these 30 years, and especially at the bottom, when we look at antibody-mediated disorders like NMO spectrum, which very much changed how we looked at some patients, and we all went back and said, oh, that wasn't MS, that was NMO. And now more recently, anti-MOG or MOGAD disease. And other than that, this is just a short list of the things that one has to think about in multiple sclerosis. Now we look at the clinical course. So we refined the clinical course. We defined it in 1996. Again, it was Steve Reingold and myself. And we modified that in 2013 to show relapsing forms of MS. And this has been expanded by regulators that sometimes get it right and sometimes get it wrong. But relapsing form of MS is any form of MS that has relapses, so that's fine. We include clinically isolated syndrome in that group because there's no relapse, right? There's only one attack, but it's a relapsing form in the sense of its biology. Relapsing remitting MS, now the regulators have sort of dichotomized secondary progressive MS into active and non-active, although they got the definition of activity wrong. But if you have relapses, then you have a relapsing form of MS. And one of the things that you see on this slide is the bottom graph shows you raw. That's the residual that occurs after an attack. And it's not inconsiderable. And Marcus Koch had a paper recently showing that the recovery from a relapse doesn't complete even at 6 months and sometimes a year. And I'm going to come back because that's very important when you think about PIRA. And then progressive forms of MS. Primary progressive MS, meaning progressive from onset. There could be relapses later, which we would call active. Secondary progressive MS is the consequence of relapsing remitting MS that then starts to gradually worsen in between or in addition to attacks. And then what we did in 2013 was add the characterization for active as to whether someone had a relapse or MRI activity, and it had to be framed in time because it had no meaning because everybody had a relapse at some point unless you were some primary progressives. And this is where the regulators got it all wrong in their labels when they were talking about active secondary progressive MS. All secondary progressive MS was active at some point. It had to be. So activity had to be framed in time. And it could be either a relapse or a new lesion on the MRI. And then we said, well, progression is not inexorable. It flattens out at times, it stops. And so same thing, over a period of time, you should be able to characterize your patient as having progressive disease. Did they progress or not progress over, say, 1 year's time? So we employed those. And then when we started to look at progressive disease, we started to think about things like Stephen Krieger's swimming pool metaphor here, which is a very interesting way of looking at MS. With each of those, I don't know if they're stalactites or stalagmites. I never get right which one comes down, which one goes up, but you know what I'm talking about. If they break the surface of the water there, they've come to clinical expression, and you have a relapse, you have an attack. If they don't they've caused damage, but it hasn't expressed itself, at least in a way that you, the clinician, are seeing it. And as the surface of that pool decreases, and that's a very interesting question as to what's causing that. Is it neurodegeneration? Is it smoldering inflammation? What's going on there? Those peaks become clinically active. So his conceptualization is this is a reincarnation of the damage already done, now hitting a clinical threshold. And I think that when you look at the role of relapses in predicting worsening disease, it very much fits this model. The mystery for us is what's causing the water level to drop. And that's where we need more information. And Stephen has a much more sophisticated setup for this than I have shown here. And then we think about the mechanisms of worsening. If you look at progressive disease and try and expand it out, is it little micro steps, which would fit in with the Krieger model, or is it really gradual deterioration over time, a more pure neurodegeneration, the kind of thing that links MS to Alzheimer's and ALS and Huntington's and Parkinson's? Not yet clear. But we do have what we see in the clinic. And even though I'm going to show you our thoughts on how we're going to change this, nothing's going to change the fact that when you're sitting in the clinic with someone, they're going to be one of these three profiles. Either they're going to be relapsing, remitting, they're going to be secondary progressive, or they're going to be primary progressive. These aren't perfect, and we're in the phases now that McDonald 2024 or 2023, I don't know what they'll call it, is going to be done. We're going to start addressing this, and I'll show you some ways, because there's a lot of people who don't like secondary progressive MS. And one of the problems is that once you say someone has progressive MS, as we currently do it, you can't take it away. And patients certainly don't like the term. And there may be ways to improve on that. And so here, this comes from Dr. Tour. Again, this idea that only two ways to get worse: relapse-associated worsening, or PIRA, progression independent of relapse activity. Now, there's been a flurry of papers about PIRA, and I'm going to address some of it here. But first, there are thoughts that all MS is progressive, that it's there at the start and it's worsening. And I very, very strongly object to that as we currently define progression. Now, part of having grayer hair and being around for a while is that I have patients now who I've been taking care of for 45 years who look great. There's absolutely nothing wrong with them other than whatever happens to people when they get into their 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so I don't think that progression in that sense is inexorable or is in every patient. And I think that there's some genetic data to support that. Now, we may look deeper and say, well, maybe these people have a little more atrophy than we'd expect them to have there. Maybe if we did detailed neuropsychological testing, we'd come up with some defects, but I'm just not seeing it. And I really object to the possibility of telling patients, telling a 25-year-old with optic neuritis and a periventricular lesion and a lesion in her optic nerve, that you have a progressive neurologic disease, because I just don't think that message is correct. And then there's PIRA. PIRA is progressive MS. It's in the name. It's either primary progressive or secondary progressive. And most importantly, PIRA is definitionally dependent. It's dependent on how you define a relapse and how you define the progression. So, for example, if you have a very stringent definition of a relapse, like you would use in a clinical trial, then you're going to have a higher percentage of people with PIRA. On the other hand, if you have a looser definition of relapse, then the amount of PIRA goes down. And my colleague Samita Satyanarayan published a really nice paper in the MS Journal several months ago showing how these definitions can affect what you call relapse-associated worsening versus what you would call PIRA. And so as a community, we haven't fully decided how to do that. It really depends on what you want to look at. But anytime you see a paper on PIRA, look to see or have them explain how they defined it. And you can call it what you want as long as you say how you defined it. But there's going to be a lot of overlap between the two, no matter what happens, unless you take a population in which you removed all of the relapses, which is possible with some of our therapies. Then you can look at what it would be pure PIRA. And of course, primary progressive MS is essentially pure PIRA. So we look at the clinical course ontology. So there's a time, and there may still be some people who think that primary progressive MS is a different disorder. I don't think so, and I'm not going to take the time to show you all the evidence that links it together, but perhaps the very best evidence that links it together is that there is a percentage, about 10%, of radiologic isolated syndrome individuals that go on to primary progressive MS. And the other 90%, if they go on to CIS and then routine RRMS. And so that kind of links it together as to how the disease is progressing. And now I just put in this other white box, the prodrome, which is a very interesting area of investigation of what happens in MS before it declares itself neurologically. And now, if we shift to the left of that, so now the prodrome is in the third box, we start to think about disease as people who have susceptibility and at risk. And I'll show you some of the susceptibility factors in a slide coming up. And then the biological onset of the disease, which we do not know when that occurs. And then the prodrome of the non-specific symptoms, multiple visits to healthcare providers, psychiatric things, headaches, a variety of stuff. And we're doing some studies now to look at this further. And then finally manifesting itself as multiple sclerosis. And of course, the idea here is to say, well, can we get the disease at an earlier and earlier stage, which is what we've done with McDonald and our clinical trials, shifting earlier and earlier, including now having treatment trials for radiologic isolated syndrome. Well, maybe we could start looking earlier if we could pick out the population of individuals at highest risk, and that would be worth screening. And so I've thought about this in general as one MS, and that is MS with an MRI onset, attack onset, or progressive onset. And then it could go on to be either active, not progressive, and such. But there's some newer ways to think of this. And this comes from Tim Kutsky from the MS Society, and things that we're starting to think about in terms of phasic approaches to multiple sclerosis. So looking at disease, stable periods, periods of relapses, relapse-associated worsening, PIRA periods, but not having to label someone as having, say, progressive disease, and that's it, that's your label, but rather look at it, and then using time framing, tailor our therapies for that aspect of the illness that best fits the phase they're in. And so I've been thinking about a dynamic approach to the disease course. Think of people who are in a relapsing phase, and we know how we would treat those. People in a progressing phase, and that might require alteration. Stable, and maybe we don't have to continue treating for periods of time. And a repair phase with hopefully metrics, especially MRI metrics, but maybe biomarkers, that tell us that repair is going on or the potential for repair is there. And then looking further at the inflammatory phase and trying to characterize that. And so we have some work going on now, very exciting work, on immunophenotyping. And not everyone has the same immune response in MS. I'm looking to see who are the players in any given persons. Some people may be more Th1 directed, others more Th17 directed, and that would inform our therapies in some way there. And then again, those people who are having most of the disease isolated within the central nervous system, constrained there, and looking for adaptive therapies. And then in the degenerative phase, maybe looking at things that hopefully we'll be able to treat for neurodegeneration, things that we may share with the Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and others that limit tissue damage at a neuronal level. Another important one, I think this probably is hard to read, is for our phenotyping to be biologically based. So when we set out in 1996 to define the clinical courses, the phenotypes, we asked the radiologists, can you distinguish for us between relapsing remitting disease and progressive disease? And they said no. And we looked at biomarkers, and they didn't work. And so we said, okay, these are the clinical features, the clinical phenotypes. This is what you see in the clinic, but they're not biologically based. And when we re-examined it in 2012 and 2013, we asked the same questions, and we got the same answers. And the answers are the same now, that we do not have a radiologic marker that distinguishes between the different clinical patterns. They can distinguish or give you hints as to who's going to have a worse course, but it doesn't tell you how they're going to worsen. And biomarkers, not yet. So we're getting there with some, but we're not there yet. So the goal, the hope, is that we can use the MRI for radiologic biopsy, looking at chronic active lesions like the slowly expanding lesions and the paramagnetic rim lesions for prognostication. We certainly can look at atrophy, both focal and diffuse. And then liquid biopsy with fluid biomarkers when we get a better handle on things like neurofilament light, GFAP, there's several others, and we may have to use a composite of biomarkers, and hopefully a composite that we can clearly attribute to one pathologic process or another. And pathologically, we're not going to biopsy, but we do have to think about what it is pathologically we're treating. The inflammation, and there again, immunophenotyping may be very helpful. The adaptive immune system, which we're pretty good at treating now. The innate immune system, which we're hopeful with the clinical trials that we have ongoing, that might be useful. Look for the pathology of demyelination, look for degeneration, both axonal and neuronal, and if we're going to study repair, and if the repair strategy is remyelination, we have to be able to use markers of axons that are intact but lacking their myelin, because we can't remyelinate degenerated axons, and that's why some of the studies have failed. And then on the far right is the genetics, and the genetics are going to inform us all the way to the left of that clinical course side in terms of susceptibility. And I'll come back to that, but one of the really interesting aspects now is the genetics of severity. So I'm going to come back to all that. So treatment, so we have our disease-modifying therapies, and you see the advertisements. We've been extremely successful with developing disease-modifying therapies for relapsing disease. We treat acute exacerbations. The science is not very good, but it's just built into the DNA of MS treatment, so we treat with steroids. We can enhance recovery with things like plasma exchange. We can enhance function with molecules like dalfampridine, and it would be nice to see if we can find others. We have symptomatic treatment, and I'll come back to that because it's very important. We don't spend a lot of time talking about it at meetings like this, but it's of critical importance to our patients and how they feel every day. We're trying to develop therapies for neuroprotection and therapies for repair, and there's some exciting early phase work underway that may inform those areas. And just a reminder, I'm not going to go through all the various symptoms, but it's very important that we pay attention to them. So you say, here's your disease-modifying therapy, here's what we're doing for your symptoms, and this goes across the entire spectrum of MS, from the minimally affected and more importantly to the markedly affected, that we take care of these various symptomatic issues. Now, looking back, and this goes back now, well, I was still born, but it's earlier than 30 years. So in the 60s, it really was, MS therapy was darkness and confusion. In the 70s, there were studies of ACTH and steroids. Their use was established, even though the studies, certainly by today's standards, were primitive. And they, every time we do a clinical trial, we learn a little more, and we get better at it. We learn lots from negative trials, just like we do from positive. But that was the 70s. In the 80s, we had trials of immunosuppressants, like cyclophosphamide, never really caught on. Cyclosporine had a sort of successful trial, but was too toxic to use in MS patients. Azathioprine was being used anecdotally, but the data from studies showed that it wasn't very helpful. Same thing with methotrexate. And there was the early interferon studies. And what you didn't know, probably, was that the early interferon studies in the 80s were done for interferon's antiviral properties, because that's why it's called interferon. It interferes with viral replication. It turned out that's probably not how it works, but that was it. And then in the 90s, we had immunomodulation with interferon beta and glutamer acetate. And then this century, things exploded with monoclonal antibodies, starting with natalizumab, and then the others, anti-CD20s, and the oral agents. And so we've come a long way, and that's what's led us to this panoply of multiple choices that we have. And so when someone asks me, well, how long does it take to do a disease-modifying therapy talk, I say, well, it takes about an hour, until you go through all of this. And I haven't even included here the slide that shows the combined decision-making that's necessary with the patient. So this was something very important from 1997, progress in the field. This came out of the NIH, the late Lael Stone and the late Henry McFarland did these studies on monthly MRIs in patients with MS, and then put them on interferon, and showed that the GAD-enhancing lesions went down dramatically. And what this led to was probably the best phase 2 proof of principle protocol in all of medicine, which was that if you did a 6-month study with your drug versus placebo, looking at either GAD-enhancing lesions, new T2 lesions, or combined unique activity, which was both, if you succeeded in reducing that in this phase 2 study, which didn't cost a lot of money, then just about every phase 3 study of those agents succeeded. Well, you could see how that would be very exciting to pharmaceuticals and biotechs, because for a very small investment, you get $1 billion drug. And it was based on this, and this has been the basis now, once this work was done, for just about every approved agent moving forward using this technique. And there's very few, if any, proof of principle studies out there in any other disease state that is so predictive of success. So this was a seminal work. And then when we look at MS, we look at things like genotypes and the environment, because they're mixed. And so we have the idea of the genetic predisposition. There's greater than 200 single nucleotide polymorphisms or alleles that increase your risk of MS by a small amount. The HLA-DR2 still is the best of that group, but none is necessary and none is sufficient, so it hasn't helped us very much. But on the bottom there in the red, there's work on genes of severity that are separate from the genes of susceptibility. And this might explain why MS, as opposed to the predictable neurodegenerative diseases that are all predictably bad, has a variable outcome, and why not all MS is progressive. Now, there was a very nice study from the MS Genetics Collaborative on that gene down there, which involved the zinc finger and some other things. Others have not been able to replicate it yet, but the idea of genes determining severity will explain a lot and may, at some time in the future, help us predict how we're going to treat individuals. On the other side, environmental factors, we've always known they're important. We know there's an issue there from the demographics and the epidemics that have occurred. EBV is out there now, and it's certainly likely that it's going to be necessary. I don't know whether it will be sufficient. Vitamin D, there's some evidence for susceptibility, but some evidence that it does not determine severity. Smoking's bad. We used to say smoking's bad, but it's specifically bad for MS and for other autoimmune diseases. Adolescent obesity seems to be a risk factor. Sodium, maybe yeah, maybe no. Exciting work on the microbiome and how that impacts both your immune system, because all of the trillions of bacteria, many of which have never been identified in your colon, are up against your largest immune organ, which is the intestinal tract. And that's producing changes not only in the immune system, but also producing chemicals, molecules that can travel to the brain. And we're starting to think very importantly now about comorbidities, especially with an aging population. So what have we gained in 30 years? So some of the intangibles. We have an international collaborative network that's been working in concert collectively and collegially. This is an incredible community. I mean, one of the blessings of working in this area is that it's such a terrific group of people to be working with. And it has been truly international level, Europe and Australia, and now more areas, Middle East and Far East and such like that. We worked more closely with biostatisticians. We wouldn't have Gary Cutter if it wasn't for actually the late John Whitaker bringing him into the MS world. We've learned how to do clinical trials, a skill we never learned as residents. We work with epidemiologists, virologists, and we've worked with regulators, for better or worse, but mostly for better, to get our drugs approved. We've also interactions with pharma and biotech, which have been mostly positive because they make the drugs that we're giving to our patients, and they help to drive innovation and translation. And Corey Ford were musing yesterday over a cocktail of the interferon wars of the late 90s, which almost none of you were aware of, but it was some very nasty marketing campaigns amongst the three interferons that were there and glutamer acetate. But it's a distant memory. So we are leading the field of therapeutics and clinical trial design. MS has also determined the importance of imaging in both research and clinical care. And it's led us to have an amazing sense of optimism. What I tell people in the consultation suite now is very different than what I told them 40 years ago, because I have a much better sense of optimism now that we could do really well with people. Some things we don't know. So we don't know long-term efficacy data. We don't know how long to treat or when to stop. And these are important issues, especially as patients get older. We don't have great comparative efficacy data of our best agents. We're not very good at defining inadequate response or even switch strategies, and how to determine responders. In every clinical trial we do, you have the treatment group, which did better than the control group. But within that treatment group, there's probably a nidus of people who are 90, 100% responders, and some people who aren't responders at all. But statistically, it makes them better than this one over here. And we need to determine those responders, because then we can tailor the therapy for any given individual. And we don't know which progressive MS patients will benefit from anti-inflammatory agents, and of course, how to better treat progressive MS. And most importantly, we don't know the cause of multiple sclerosis or the autoimmune target. And that puts us behind things like NMO and myasthenia gravis, where we know the targets. So some influencers along my journey, the late Henry McFarlane, who was so important in bringing MRI into MS, Steve Reingold, the MS Society. On the far right there, some but not all of our international colleagues that we've been collaborating with and have done so much themselves to advance the course of MS. Gary Cutter and Jerry Walensky, who I couldn't have done the CombiRx trial without their guidance and wisdom. Bob Nobler brought interferon to Jefferson when I was there, and so that was seminal. And then, of course, my family on the left, which do influence me. And then my colleagues at the Corinne Goldsmith Dickinson Center for Multiple Sclerosis, who inspire me every day. And with that, I thank you all for your attention.
a little bit of back